Good morning. Today lecture devoted ontology. The first, ontology. What is ontology? Ontology is study of being. It focuses on several related questions. What things exist? Stars, unicorns, and others. What categories do they belong to? A number of physical properties or just ideas? Is there such a thing as objective reality? What does the verb to be mean? Some of these questions may seem painfully abstract and not very useful, but they are and always have been enormously important to some philosophers, especially to those who believe in foundamentalism. Foundationalism philosopher believes that to arrive at truth, it is necessary to start with the most fundamental issues, to be sure about the foundations of philosophy, and then work our way up from there to more specific questions. If you believe in foundationalism, then probably the most important questions are ontological questions. Ontology is also highly relevant to religions and spirituality. No matter what you believe about spirituality, they have an ontological dimension. All of the following are ontological statements. Everything is made of atom and energy. Everything is made of consciousness. You have a soul, yeah, you have a mind. Ontology, metaphysics. Ontology is generally considered be a subfield of metaphysics. Metaphysics has many definitions, but it means something like the study of the fundamental nature of reality. Clearly, this is closely related to ontological questions. There is an overlap between ontology and metaphysics, which covers questions like what is existence or how do things exist. However, as a rule of thumb, we can say the ontological asks what questions, while metaphysics asks how questions. Example: the difference between ontology and metaphysics may be either to understanding if we look at a made-up world. Take a fantasy world like Tolkien, Middle Earth. Its ontology is different from ours because it has all kinds of things in it, like elves, orcs, and dark lords, that don't exist in our world, but its metaphysics are different because it has a fundamentally different nature involving magic. Middle Earth doesn't just have different things. In it, the things played by different rulers. Ontology studies the things, while metaphysics studies the rules. Ontology, epistemology. Ontology and metaphysics both get confused with epistemology, but epistemology is easier to separate out. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. of how we know what we know. Whereas ontology and metaphysics are about reality, epistemology is about how human consciousness can interact with that reality. Ontology. Do soul exist? Are the sort of things that obey physical laws? Metaphysics. What physical laws would have to be true in order for soul exist? Epistemology. Guys, sorry. Uh, what rules if any govern God's actions? Famous quotes about ontology. Quote 1. Beyond the fiction of reality, there is the reality of the fiction. Slavoj Žižek. Slavoj Žižek is Slovenian philosopher, highly influential in certain philosophical circles. Thought other circles dismiss him entirely that philosophy for you. His ontology is hard to describe in its specifics by for starters, like many philosophers, he sees a deep split between reality and language. Language separates the world into all sorts of different parts and categories, but those categories are little more than useful fictions. The fictions, thought, are real stories about fictional categories. Or, in other words, everything we can say about reality is fictional, but language itself a reality of its own. Quite two. You don't have a soul. You are soul. You have a body. Anonyms. This quote, often incorrectly attributed to Lewis, probably comes from a Quaker magazine in the 18th, 19th centuries. It argues for a very particular ontological perspective. Soul exists, clearly ontological claim, but they are not the sort of things that you can have or own an ontological metaphysical claim. Bodies, on the other hand, do belong to the category, but the consciousness currently reading this word is a soul. The history and reporting of ontology. In a sense, ontology is one of the oldest forms of philosophy. An ape climbs a tree hoping to find wild figs. Some would say that the ape's behavior suggests the ontological question of whether there are any figs up there. It's not a very elaborate or philosophical sort of ontology, but is the same general sort of question. The Greek philosophers were somewhat obsessive ontologicals. In their desire for complete knowledge of the world, they tended to categorize things and argue about what the categories should be and what should belong to them. For example, Aristotle made a highly influential argument about the ladder of nature, which placed non-living beings at the bottom, for example, rocks and clouds, then moved up to plants, then animals, and finally human beings. This is an ontological theory of the natural world, and it had a huge impact on medieval philosophy and far-reaching implications for Aristotle's morals theory. This sort of ontology wasn't practiced only in the West. Arab, Indian, and Chinese philosophers also studied the world around them, deduced general rules of existence, and tried to categorize things. Thanks to the global trade networks of the ancient and medieval worlds, these philosophers all influenced one another. Arabs argued about Aristotle's, Romans argued about the Indian Vedic traditions, and so on. These traditions of ontology were never entirely separate from each other. The scientific revolution brought about a deep change in ontology. Many of the early scientists realized that the only way to be certain that they were discovering truths about nature was to forget about anything, at least while doing science, that could be tested and proven, which seems to include supernatural beings, divine forces, and souls. Only physical laws, matter, and energy seem to measurable and obey reliable laws. Many of them also had religious beliefs, and some of them even carried out experiments concerning the supernatural, but for the most part they found that it was necessary to assume that only the material world exists in order to carry out sensible experiments and derive law of nature from them. This scientific ontology has been too successful in terms of understanding nature and controlling it that it has come to dominate the way we think about everything, including for some people, religion. For example, there are institutes in the world that seek to prove or disprove the existence of God by experiment, but this seems a little confused and certainly would have surprised both believers and scientists during the scientific revolution. Most of them would have told you that God, if he, she, it exists, is not the sort of the thing that can be proven or disproven by experiment. That God belongs to a different ontological category from the natural phenomena that we observe in science. Ontology in popular culture. Example, in the original Star Wars movies, the force is presented as a semi-mystical or magical force, an energy field created by all living things that seems to go beyond nature's law as we know it. But in the prequels, the force is presented in more scientific terms. We learn that there are teeny microorganisms called midi-chlorians living in the bloodstreams of human beings. This makes a difference for the ontology of Star Wars universe because it adds a new kind of being. And it also changes the metaphysics because the Star Wars universe now plays by slightly more familiar scientific rules. Second example, Game of Thrones is a rare example of fantasy story with a very strange ontology. but very realistic metaphysics. In the story, there are dragons, giants, zombies, and all sorts of other fantasy creatures that don't exist in the real world. However, all these creatures behave according to very familiar laws, which gives the series a more realistic feel. At certain points, the show includes magic, but is relatively rare and always seems separating because otherwise the show is hyper realistic. Due to the relative absence of magic, the show can be said to have a pretty realistic metaphysics in spite of its fantasy ontology. The controversies ontology should be even broader. Many students fall asleep during ontology lectures. Even many professional philosophers do not practice ontology. They argue that being is a vague idea, maybe just an artifact of language, and that there is no point in analyzing it intensively. The word to be is just a useful tool that human beings have evolved in order to get through the daily lives. It doesn't have a specific meaning, and therefore ontology is sorting for something that isn't there. Some also argue that it is pointless for philosophers to try and work out what exists in the universe, that instead we should leave that to scientists. Of course, this argument meets stiff resistance from many philosophers. We treat ontology as central. Remember, the fundamentalists from sections first. They would not agree that ontology is pointless. Moreover, ontology and metaphysics have gained some new energy lately, thanks to the mystifying implications of quantum physics and the science of consciousness, which are turning many scientists into philosophers and vice versa.